Hi, this is John Sablan, one half of To Have and To Hold podcast, and Nichole and I are so very blessed that you decided to join us on this journey to improve your marriage, your family life, and your relationships. Now, as a disclaimer, Nichole and I are not perfect. We're not your counselors, and we don't desire to be your spiritual directors. What we do desire, though, is to lend this podcast as an opportunity for us to journey together in holiness and virtue, and to share our experiences of marriage and family life, and what we've learned, what we've encountered, so that it may bless you and your family and your relationships. Now, if you disagree, or if your experience is different, or perhaps if we say something in mistake or in error, you are free to absolutely reject it, my dear brother and sister in Christ. So we just wanted to leave that with you, and we thank you again for your support, and most especially your prayers. So please share, like, subscribe, leave us a comment, and let us know how God is blessing you through this podcast. May God bless you and keep you always.
My favorite thing in the whole world is dessert. If anyone knows me, knows that I have not only just one sweet tooth, but like 10. But anyway, so
I've got a whole mouthful.
So when I have
Welcome back to another episode of To Have and To Hold, coming to you again from the Sablan Chapel. Trying this out for a little bit, but you never know. So welcome back, baby.
Yeah, thank you.
We are toasting today, so grab your drink. Especially as we just celebrated Independence Day, the last episode we were on. We're gonna toast to the pursuit of happiness. Here's to it. The pursuit of happiness, right? I mean, like, what is that? What does that mean? You know, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. We wanted to have an episode where we talk about specifically the comparison game, right? That there's, I think we can all agree that we all are on the search for happiness, and that's a good thing. But how we define it is a different thing, and how we go about achieving it, obtaining it, is definitely there's a difference in our world today. I think one of the things, love, that come to mind specifically is the comparison game people play on social media.
Right. So in terms of happiness, I would like for all the listeners, if you haven't done so already, to look at Father Robert Spitzer's 4 levels of happiness. And what we're going to do is we're going to kind of bypass level 1. Really quickly. It's more of a sensual. It's more like
At the fleshful level.
It's right. So it's like, maybe food. My favorite thing in the whole world is dessert. If anyone knows me, knows that I have not only just one sweet tooth, but like 10. But anyway, so
I've got a whole mouthful.
So when I have something, so how Father Robert Spitzer would explain it is like you have, for me, it would be my brownie, right, with salted caramel. And I would take a bite and it's like, ooh, I feel the tingly sensation all through my body. I am happy for that moment. But then what happens is that it doesn't extend to anyone else. It doesn't last for a long time. It's not
short-lived.
It's short-lived, yes. And it doesn't impact other people. And then there's a level 2, which I'd like to really talk about, which is
The self-ego comparison.
Correct. And I was thinking about, as we were thinking about the pursuit of happiness, there's a lot of people who battle with depression and anxiety. And what we're seeing is that there's a correlation. I don't want to say it's a causation, but there is a correlation between high levels of anxiety and depression, and also watching or looking at social media. Because what happens when we spend an enormous amount of time on social media, we tend to play this comparison game, which is when I'm comparing my worst to someone else's best. And so when I'm looking, prior to social media, we'd say something about comparing just to the Joneses, or keeping up with the Joneses. Keeping up with the Joneses. So now it's like we're keeping up with trying to keep up with everything on social media. And what's hard is that people are looking at, there's filters now, and people are only, of course, showing what they want to.
Yeah, they're dictating what they want to show you about them.
Correct.
Whether it's true or not, whether it's authentic or not, you have no idea. But that's what they're putting in front of you.
Right. And if we're always comparing ourselves to that, how it can lead to anxiety, into depression. And that's really what I wanted to talk about, is what Father Robert Spitzer talks about, is the comparison game and what that could look like in marriage.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that was kind of leading off with that social media piece, is the temptation to compare yourself to what is the perceived view of others. But what does that look like in the married life? I would say, just an idea, one thing that comes to mind is specifically for the men out there, but there's a challenge, I think, for most men, is the provider aspect of being a man. So and I think this is relative to your spouse. So if your spouse happens to be a working spouse, meaning she has a career and she's working outside of the home, and she happens to make more money than you, right? Or maybe she has, you've always been a blue collar person and you didn't go to get a degree after school and she did. And there's the temptation to have a level of comparison with, especially because the world will tell you a different story, right? Rather than seeing each other as battle partners. And you may take offense to that, or you may compare yourself to maybe not being worthy, or you feel less of a man because you maybe not make as much money, or you maybe not be perceived as being as smart as your spouse, right? And I think that's more of a temptation for man because of the kind of locker room kind of mentality that's out there with men, right? Always trying to poke and test your manhood and challenge you and just this false bravado. And I think that's one of the things that we can do in a married situation where we can really be insecure and find ourselves comparing ourselves to our spouse as it relates to status, right? Or perhaps education. And, one of the things, I'm not sure if we brought this up in even our marriage summer talk, perhaps, but in one of the previous episodes or not, but we can go through it again when we think about the sin of contempt, right? Speaking to one another at a place of, I'm better than you.
Right.
It's condensation, right? I'm condescending. So that's a temptation, a self-comparison game, right? That somehow we've got to be either ahead or at least equal to one another from the material perspective. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. But aside from just the status, I think in perhaps it's educational level or maybe it's a salary amount, but that the actual work that we do. So if I'm a stay-home mother, who's to say that your work, because you go outside the home, is more important than mine? Right?
No, and I would say for the stay-at-home parents out there, and especially the mothers, that is probably...
Or a father.
Or father, yeah. I mean, depending on the scenario, that is the most important job you will ever have outside of being spouses is raising your kids. That has a long-lasting effect, not just internally, but in the entire world and society as a whole. So yeah, I would say that's definitely something where for the men out there, I challenge you all, because we can tend to be that way, right? Whereas we tend to think that because we're out there providing, we're the hunters, the gatherers, whatnot, that when we come home, that our wives weren't doing anything but raising our kids all day long. And that's an ignorant way of approaching it, to be quite honest, and an unfair situation. And so, realize that, for one, nobody can raise your kids better than you, and love your kids as much as you can love them. But at the same time, that raising children is very difficult, especially in this day and age, in this time that we live in. So that's a great point, love, that, I definitely want to make sure not only can we compare each other that way, but then, for those that do stay at home and raise your kids, which is, to me, I commend you for those parents and families that do that, right? That actually make the sacrifice to say, could we be a 2-income family home? Sure. But who's going to raise our kids?
Right.
Daddy's daycare over here. I mean, that's just not going to work. So, anyway, I think that was a great point to bring up as well.
Another one I would say is comparing in terms of, or just keeping score. Like for an example, if, I'm the one that's making dinner or doing the dishes or whatever, and I continue to keep score, and I'm comparing the amount of things I do, maybe as in terms of the domestic chores, and what you do. And that's another way, that comparison. And so instead of just really doing the work that I'm called to do and to glorify God, maybe I'm looking at, well, you're not doing as much. And when I do that and I'm doing this comparison, then really I'm going to feel sad with the outcome, right? It's kind of like I'm going inward, self-pity, and that's
navel-gazing. Yeah.
That's a danger zone, really. When we see ourselves going inward, what we need to do is go out, right? And when we serve, we do it for our families, regardless if we feel that they deserve it or not, but we do it to glorify God.
And I think for it to be a true act of charity, there isn't conditions.
Right.
There isn't a expected response. Not to say we're not necessarily justified in wanting to be acknowledged and recognized and thanked, right? But if that's why you're doing it,
it's a very human thing.
Yeah, it's a human thing for sure. But if that's why you're doing it, then it's indirect self-love. Right? That you actually have a condition upon that service. And especially when I speak to the men, when I think about who are the chief servant, protectors, and defenders of the family, it's the man. And so it is my responsibility to lay down my life in Ephesians 5 kind of way, as Christ laid down his life for his bride, the church, and I need to do that for my wife and my kids. But to your point, because I'm not free from that temptation or sin, right, of keeping score and really checking, like we were even talking about in the last episode about purified intentions. If you're doing something only to get credit or get acknowledged, then it's really about you, less about the right. And another way I think that you just pointed out, in a way to get out of yourself, is doing something for somebody else.
Exactly.
When you find yourself down and out, depressed, just struggling, navel gazing, the best way to get out of that is to actually go do something for somebody else. And it's the quickest way to kind of pull yourself from that.
It actually brings to mind the scripture where Jesus says, if you only love those who love you back, what good is it? I mean, even the pagans do that,
right.
Right? And so what we're called to love when really people can't pay us back, right? That's true charity.
Yeah. So those are definitely some ways as far as keeping score. I think, some of the other examples, or one key example that I think also comes to mind, is the number of hurts, the disappointments. You said that, right? So when you, with great expectation comes great disappointment. So when you have a little notepad, a mental notepad that you're saying, okay, you did it again. You didn't tell me that, it was beautiful today, or you didn't pick up yourself. You told me you would, you told me you're going to pick up your clothes or after yourself, or you said you were going to, I've been talking to you about getting X honey-do list done, and you keep saying yes. And then look, now 2 days won't go by, 3 days. And so when you're keeping tabs, that keeping score mentality, rather than just communicating clearly, especially for us men, just because, we're not very good at reading between the lines sometimes. And so we need to be spoken to directly. And, I guess, false expectation that your spouse is somehow going to know what you're what you're feeling, what you're thinking, what you're needing at that moment. So keeping score, and I think that comparison of how many times you hurt me versus how many times I hurt you.
Or how much you showed me. It sounds like what you're saying is how much you showed me love. Maybe, if I'm needing... if my love language is affirmation, you said you talked about being, beautiful or something like that. Maybe I need affirmation, or maybe it's acts of service or whatever. And I'm saying, okay, I did these things, and really not communicating with my spouse in terms of what he or she needs.
Right. Yeah, it's not being reciprocated. Right? So then all of a sudden because you're keeping score, and it's just a unhealthy way of approaching relationships. We've talked about temperaments. We talked about our natural inclinations towards a specific response or behavior. And we've, there's so many things and just the dynamics of family life. You're pulled in so many different directions. You got a lot of responsibilities, especially for those of us who do have children. It's just a slippery slope when you get, anytime you're keeping score or doing a comparison towards anybody else, and specifically within your family, it's dangerous. It can lead to a lot of contention and strife within the family life.
What about in terms of growing in the spiritual life? Again, I guess it really goes to that expectation. Maybe it's, I'm thinking, well, look what I'm doing. I'm praying, or I'm going to mass and you're not. And maybe doing a comparison in that way. I'm growing in the spiritual life and you're not. You're weighing me down or something.
It's real. I mean, I can see, even just in our own path, right? You were pulling the spiritual train ahead, and I was a spiritual sloth. So in a lot of ways, just coming at from that perspective, you had a legitimate, valid right to feel that way, because I wasn't doing what I needed to do. But realizing, when we've talked about the sacrament of marriage, that what you do to sanctify the spouse actually sanctifies them and you. And so anytime you start playing that game of tit for tat, of what I'm doing versus what the other person's not doing, it's not a good situation, and it's just going to lead to resentment, honestly, and you harbor hate in your own heart, and that's just poison of the evil one.
Right.
So I think that's to your point, love, that's not a good thing, even though I can understand the humanness of saying, especially because the desire is to grow in your spirituality. The problem is it's disturbing your peace, and it's less about God and it's more about the other person.
Right. And so if you're in a situation like that, and there was a time that it was that way. However, I didn't look at in a way to keeping score. Rather, anytime I went to mass, just offer it up for my husband. Anytime I did my holy hour, offer it up for my husband. Anytime the daily rosaries for my husband. It wasn't like I'm doing this. I think that there could be a temptation, but once you do that, it really goes. And like I said, you can fall into self-pity, and that's a danger zone. It's better to offer those things up for your spouse. And if you want to lead them to Christ, it's going to be through modeling. And it's that consistency.
And invitation, I would say, right? The invite, placing the invite. Hey, I'm going to go pray. I'm going to go to mass.
Do you want to join me? If not, you just go anyway. So again, I just want to make sure it's clear that in terms of the comparison game, that could really cause, again, it's negative outcomes. So it's important for us not to do that, even though, like you're saying, it could be true. But it's really an ugly game to play with.
Yeah. So let's talk about one of the things that came to mind as a woman, right? Is there's not to say men are free from this at all, but the temptation to compare yourselves to others.
Yes.
Right. Other women. Specifically, like from your spouse's perspective, right? Like, I wonder if if you're comparing yourself to this person, I'm not that thin, I'm not that tall, my hair's not this, my hair's not that, I don't have that eye color, and then is that an issue, I guess, for women?
So in terms of comparing ourselves to other people, and I think that that's true, and it's so easy to do, especially in social media, is what we're finding is the women are comparing themselves to other women. And again, like I said, with the filters, you're really comparing yourself to something that's not real. It's, you just can't. So I would say yes. The other thing too is that there's an article I read about one of the reasons why women get ready, this is like a long time ago I read, one of the reasons why women get ready, the men think it's for men, but it's really for other women, you know, it's because they're trying to, I guess, size each other up. I'm not quite sure. But anyway, so there is some truth to that. And I would say, again, that's really a danger zone. But you know what I was thinking is not just comparing yourself to other women, is comparing your marriage to other people's marriages.
Ooh, good one.
And so, you know, if I had this spouse, then maybe I wouldn't endure this or that or the other. You know, it's always like the grass is greener on the other side.
Yeah.
And when we know, as you were sharing just in the last episode, that when we committed to our vows, we did this in front of an altar, the altar of sacrifice, under a crucifix. Right? So again, God is saying it's not going to be easy, right? And wherever you go, whatever marriage, there's going to be a cross. But you're asked to pick up the cross that you're given in your sacrament to lead for sanctification so that you and your spouse are led back to Him, right? It's no different in other marriages. We like to think that the grass is greener. But I would say for those people who maybe think the grass is greener on the other side is try watering your own grass, right?
Yeah, put some Miracle Grow on that bad boy. You know, what are you doing to cultivate life and love within that own marriage? And I, you know, that's such a great point, love, because I think the challenge is to think somehow that other marriages aren't going through
or without the cross,
or without the cross, and that's the part where, you know, I mean, we fall into that category too. You see us on camera, right? You may see posts. You don't know what our family life's like, right? And it's beautiful, by the way. But I'm just saying, but
all marriages are beautiful.
That's right.
Now, does that mean all the time and what we expect? No, it doesn't. Because there's hurt, there's disappointments. Because what we're long for is God, and God is perfect. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we look to someone in our family, whether it's going to be, typically it's our spouse or whomever, and we want them to be the perfect everything. And that's not possible. And that's really unfair to put that sort of pressure on one another because we can never fulfill it, right?
No, you're absolutely right. And I think that's the grass isn't greener on the other side. Everybody comes, with, pre-built, inherited original sin. Everybody comes with their own sets of issues, problems, and if you're trading in one set, you'll get in another set. It's the old story of the person who says, "I want a different cross," and they go and pick the one in the corner that's the smallest one, and they're like, God's like, "That's the one you came in with." That's
right.
Right? It's the smallest one in their room, and I think that's sometimes the way we approach marriage. People, and the culture tells you, right? Trade up, trade out, trade in, right? That if it's not working out, just cancel. It's a cancel culture. This, and that. It's terrible, and that's not what we signed up for. And that's the thing, is going back to the marital vows and the marriage. You signed up for in sickness and in health, right? For rich or for poor, in good times and in bad. But oftentimes we only hear health, rich, and good, right? But you signed up. So when people tell us, "Why didn't I sign up for this?" I'm like, actually, you did. You signed up for all of it, right? You just weren't expecting it to materialize in this specific way. And now you got to pay the piper. And I think when you approach it in a way that, somehow my marriage, my life would be better if I had this type of spouse, you're crazy. You're crazy. And I think marriage, the beautiful thing about the sacrament of marriage is that it really is a pathway towards sanctification, that it highlights our own defects, our own wounds, the things that need to be purified and purged from us in order for us to be one with God, which is ultimately the goal of marriage, right? Is the beatific vision, is getting us to be one in union with God.
Which is our ultimate happiness.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. When we talked about toasting the pursuit of happiness, it's God himself, right? It's God himself. Any other examples you have, love, that you can think of that we should talk about?
I mean, really the comparison game can be played in so many different ways. And I think what's most important is that when you're recognizing it, that's occurring, somehow take a step back and really, assess what's going on at a deeper level. And am I trying to fulfill this whole? Am I seeking something? And am I using another person or other things kind of to fill this hole? Or am I turning to God?
Yeah, we've talked about it before about deifying your spouse or your children, right? That you make them everything, right? Whether it's intentionally or unintentionally, that point would be is if you have expectations of perfection, zero failure, zero disappointments, you have a godlike expectation of your spouse that you will be disappointed.
Right.
It's unfair and unrealistic, and I think that's kind of the trick of the devil, right? It's like, look at him.
Yes.
Right? He doesn't X, Y, and Z, fill in the blank. And, you have to be aware of that. That's why we say 3 to get married, right? Is that God at the center, the grace of the sacrament, God's divine life working through the sacrament of marriage. But at the same time, also putting things in their proper place. That Nichole can never fulfill me the way God will.
That's right.
And does. Now, what she has is a responsibility within the sacrament, right? So from an earthly perspective, from a human perspective, she has a role in my sanctification and a role in my happiness, if you will, to lead me towards that, right? So again, that final destination is with God. And because as Christ said, right, we're not married in heaven. Right? We're, in a sense, we're not married to each other, we're married to God, right? The bridegroom, we're finally with the bridegroom. It's the wedding feast of the Lamb at that point. So, it's key to remember that as we kind of try to, again, improve our marriage, improve our relationships, that the comparison game is not a good game to play.
And the other thing I would say is that if you do find yourself in the midst of the comparison game, really look at gratitude. And all the things that you're thankful for, all the blessings, because I guarantee that God has blessed you in some way, in some fashion. And so really in prayer, spend some time in prayer and think about all the many blessings that you have.
Yeah, and so I think as a final note, I would say, I know we've shared this before, but part of our nightly examine is one of the key things that Nichole just talked about is gratitude. What are we thankful for today? The second thing is, how is God working in our life today, right? Being very intentional about seeing God active in your life in that day. The third thing from the relationship side is, how did you feel my love? And again, that was, allowing our spouse to be able to recognize, or if not, say, well, I also did X, right, as an act of love. I didn't even know that, right? Or that would be an opportunity to be able to declare those acts of love. And then finally is, what can we do better for one another? And I think these are just small ways that we can stay connected to each other in Christ, in God, through the sacrament, that we can combat and avoid the negative outcomes of the comparison game. So hopefully that was something that was a benefit to you. And again, we can ask you to continue to like, share, comment, subscribe. Let us know what we can do to help improve your marriage, your relationships, your perspective on faith and life and all things included. So we just want to toast to true happiness, which is our Lord himself.
That's right.
May we be with him one day. And may God bless you and keep you always.